Please come in. Come on in here. I'm Michael Crapon. I'm the co-founder of the Stimson Center. It is with gratitude and pleasure that I'm convening this event. It's part of a series of conversations about nuclear danger and looking back, but just as important, looking forward. Where do we go from here? How do we pick up the pieces? A crucial piece is the nonproliferation piece. And I leaned on Scott Sagan to come and grace the Stimson Center with a talk. I've got the third edition here. I've traded with one of our RAs who had it. I have the second edition. I love this book. And when I was teaching at the University of Virginia, there was no better book to elicit reactions and thoughtful conversation among students. So I've asked Scott, the first edition is over 20 years, I think. So I've asked Scott to talk to us about how he's thinking about the problem now and where we go from here. His mentees are legion throughout academia and elsewhere. In addition to this book, as important as it is, I'm not sure it's his most important book. He's written books on nuclear targeting, on the limits of safety with respect to the nuclear danger. And he's written articles that have stood the test of time. So it's great to have him here. Susan Burk will follow and be our first commentator. Susan has served the US government for 3.5 decades, working this problem. She was the person who helped stabilize and make effective US diplomacy at Nonproliferation Treaty review conferences, including one that she ran the US delegation as ambassador. Matt Kroenig is here, and Matt's got a book too that I'm flogging books now. The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Very, I think, a purposefully contentious book. And I recommend that you read it because it could shake up some of your thinking, make you rethink some of your assumptions. He's at Georgetown, as you probably know, also the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. And welcome to you, Matt. Joan Rohlfing, also a commentator. You know, Joan did a long stint of public service at the Energy Department, working nuclear issues. And that work was very consequential. I think the work she's doing at the Nuclear Threat Initiative is even more consequential. And she's got a knack for programming and for bringing people together. So thank you, Joan, for joining us. Scott, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Michael. And let me start just by saying how pleased I am to have this knowledgeable and influential audience, but especially to have Michael, Susan, Matt, and Joan join me today, people from whom I've learned so much over the years. And Michael, as he mentioned, asked me to reflect upon the pessimist-optimist debate that Ken Waltz and I sparked with the first edition of our book. And I'll do that with 5 different topics. One is just to outline very briefly some of the key points that I think an organization theory perspective on nuclear weapons and nonproliferation leads you to. Second, say what I think I got right over the years. And then third, talk about 3 things that I think I got wrong or that I misunderstood, or underestimated the problem. Turning, not surprisingly, number 4, to Donald Trump and what I will call cliffs on the backside of the summit. Big summit, cliffs on the backside. And lastly, talk about what I hope are not cliffs, but I fear are real dangers with the NPT, and we'll then pass it off to Susan to talk about the ban treaty and the NPT, because I think we're in for a troubled time. So first off, the insights that started this debate with Ken Waltz many years ago came from a belief that nuclear weapons, in theory, because of their destructive power, should deter any state or statesman from starting a war in which nuclear weapons are likely to be used. But I know from the time I spent inside the Pentagon and from other reading that nuclear weapons are not controlled by this abstract entity we call the state. They're not controlled even by politicians that we call sometimes statesmen. They're controlled by normal, human, imperfect individuals inside normal, very imperfect organizations. And organizations have their own biases, they have their own standard operating procedures, they have their own flaws. We like to think of the Strategic Command or the U.S. Air Force as being perfect. I think about them as being more like the IRS or the Post Office or other organizations that screw things up on occasion. They're better, but they screw things up, and we should expect that and not expect perfection. And that led me to emphasize concerns about preventive war. Even if nuclear weapons could produce a condition of mutually assured destruction or beliefs in stability, that during the period in which one state has them and a rival does not, there's going to be a grave danger of preventive war, and the military will put pressure on politicians to engage in preventive war. Militaries don't like war, but if you're going to go to war, they want to go big and decisively, and the best time to do it is early. I talked a lot about accidents. You should figure that imperfect organizations will occasionally have safety problems. I don't believe that even our best efforts to create high reliability organizations can produce perfect. I don't believe that any effort to create redundancy can eliminate all problems of common mode errors. And lastly, a perspective on organizations leads you to be concerned about the kinds of advice that individual political leaders sometimes get, and that we should be concerned when people surround themselves with yes men who tell an autocratic leader what it is that he or she wants to hear, and that our theories of deterrence are often based on, if not a pristine rationality, at least really good organizational decision-making, presenting options and thinking through options up in front, and that an organizational perspective says when that happens, it's great, but in often autocratic systems, when those command and control procedures or checks and balances are not in place, you're going to have real problems. And that led me to be much more pessimistic about the consequences of the spread of nuclear weapons. Well, what did I get right? I think looking back, much of the history of some of the recent years reflect well on, or reflect poorly, depending on your judgment, reflect well on the theory and poorly in terms of stability. And it would be true even going further back before we wrote this book. We now know a lot about American interest in preventive war during the late 40s, early 50s, where President Truman made a decision in NSC 68 not to engage in a preventive war against the Soviet Union. And when military desire to engage in preventive war is pushed aside, is officially restricted, it simply goes underground. And people work behind the scenes to engage in preventive war or to put pressures for preventive war. So we now know that up until the mid-1950s, the Air Force was arguing, as General Twining put it in a top-secret memorandum to his fellow Joint Chiefs of Staff, that we should engage in actions that would entail general war. Otherwise, we will have left our fate to a small band of proven barbarians, which is particularly ironic. Not that the Soviet Union were not barbaric in many ways, but he was talking about engaging in a war that would kill millions and millions of innocent Soviet citizens in the name of preventing proven barbarians from having weapons that could attack the United States. We also know much more about accidents. The limits of safety revealed a number of close calls with nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis and later, and only when some brave journalists published stories about the Minot Barksdale incident did we find out that the Air Force was suffering from severe problems of safety culture lagging behind the need, when even within the last decade we had incidents of the United States losing nuclear weapons for a short period of time. That incident, by the way, I've always believed was far more dangerous than people have acknowledged, because not only did we lose where the weapons were and have inadequate guarding, that is security at Barksdale, because the guys on the base didn't know that they had nuclear weapons on the B-52 out on the runway, so they didn't have the special security force. But had there been an incident on the plane, they wouldn't have jettisoned the weapons the way they should have, because they didn't know that they had nuclear weapons on board. So they would have had to try to execute a crash landing, a rare but not a totally impossible event, with nuclear weapons on board, but not knowing that they had nuclear weapons on board. There's a safety ruling that wouldn't have happened. And lastly, I think we know a lot now about Saddam Hussein and his behavior in 1991 and 2002, 2003, that illuminates really grave dangers of surrounding yourself with yes men who tell you what it is that you think you want to know, or what they think you want to know, and you make decisions in some rough rational way, but based on really faulty information. So Saddam insisted that the United States was not going to react to the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, in part because he had signaled that, and everybody kept reinforcing that belief to him. He thought that his chemical weapons would be adequate to deter American and Israeli nuclear escalation. And people didn't tell him because they were afraid to report that their chemical weapons were not nearly as strong as he thought they were. And lastly, one of the most chilling documents that illuminates the dangers of proliferation is to read the transcript of his conversation with his senior officers, saying that if I get killed, I want you to launch everything that we have against Israel and American bases in Saudi Arabia. We were lucky in 1991 that we didn't kill Saddam in our efforts that time around. And we were fortunate that George H.W. Bush and Brett Scowcroft decided not to continue marching all the way to Baghdad, because that could well have meant a massive chemical attack because of pre-delegated authority, because of the organizational structures that Saddam set up. So all of these make me very pessimistic about the consequences of new countries getting nuclear weapons. But what did I get wrong? I want to emphasize 3 points here that I didn't know or I underestimated. They unfortunately, in 2 out of the 3, make me more pessimistic. 1 makes me more optimistic. First, it makes me less more pessimistic is that I underestimated how hawkish the American public was. I believe that the United States public, at least, had a taboo, to use the term that Nina Tannenwald in her magisterial book illustrates and comments on, against using nuclear weapons, and that if we were unfortunate enough to get in a crisis, public opinion would strongly discourage a president from making the ultimate choice to initiate nuclear weapons use. That evidence turns out to be wrong, or that assumption turns out to be wrong. We now know from polling, many people have looked at the regular public opinion polls that show that public support for using nuclear weapons, say, if you ask someone, did Truman make the right decision? The percentage of Americans who say yes was at its height, not surprising, 85% in 1945, and it's below 45% if you ask them that question in a binary way, yes or no, today. In 1945, if you asked a more complicated question, 23% of the public said we should have continued dropping the bomb on more Japanese cities and not give them a chance to surrender. Today, less than 2% of the American public says that's right. So I used to think, oh, well, that's all suggesting that there's really a norm, and people like Tannenwald or Netta Crawford at BU, or Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, who talked about the growing non-combatant immunity norm, that the public just thinks killing non-combatants is simply wrong. Well, there's a problem with that data, and that no one had asked people or put people in the condition that they were at in 1945, contemplating a trade-off between killing Americans by invading a country and using nuclear weapons against non-combatants to try to shock a society into surrendering. Ben Valentino and I hired the firm YouGov to create a set of representative samples of the American public 2 years ago, and found that in this hypothetical situation where Iran was accused by the United States of violating the JCPOA, we put sanctions back on. They attacked an American warship in the Persian Gulf. We declared war. The president called for unconditional surrender and was told that we can win a conventional invasion, but it'll cost us 20,000 US lives. Or we can drop a nuclear weapon on the second largest city in Iran. And then we varied in the experiment the numbers killed from 100,000, a Hiroshima-type blast, to 2 million, thinking that surely by 2 million people would say no. And then also have one conventional scenario, killing 100,000 with conventional weapons, and found that the American public, instead of that 45% that said Truman did the right thing, 60% were willing to use nuclear weapons in this scenario just to save 20,000 American troops. They killed 100,000. It did not go down at 2 million, and it went up an extra 10%, up to 70% with conventional weapons. People had some aversion, 10% of the public had an aversion to using nuclear weapons, but not to killing innocent civilians. Republicans were more hawkish than Democrats. Older people were more hawkish than younger people. Women were as hawkish, and in the 2 million control group were more hawkish than men. We don't know whether that's because of socialization or inherent gender characteristics, but some of the same reasons why women are more dovish generally, not wanting to go to war, wanting to get out of wars more quickly than men, may reflect a desire to protect loved ones. And if you're in a trade-off between protecting loved ones and killing innocent people on the other side, women were as hawkish, and as I said, even more hawkish. The single factor that correlates most strongly with willingness to use nuclear weapons in our survey experiments is whether you agree with the American law imposing a death penalty on convicted murderers. That somehow our sense of retributiveness came out really loud and clear in this polling and in the reasons why people explain that Iran did it first. It's not our fault. 70% of the people who voted to use nuclear weapons said the Iranian people deserve some of the responsibility for us killing them because they didn't overthrow their own government. It's their fault, not ours. This suggests to me that the public will be a goad if we're ever in a crisis, not a constraint. The second thing I didn't get right, I think, is a more positive note, in that I didn't understand the important sea change that's happened inside the US military as they have become more comfortable with, indeed, one of the strongest supporters of the laws of armed conflict. Soldiers want to be warriors. They don't want to be murderers. And after My Lai, there was a concerted effort to get officers from the first day you enter a service academy to understand what an illegal order is and that you should not follow it. And this, in the nuclear space, finally gets implemented in the Obama administration's executive order saying that you should have the principles of distinction and proportionality in all military plans, including the nuclear weapons plans. And having spent some time in Omaha, I know that people take that task very seriously. And the third thing that I got wrong, on the negative side, in my view, on the risky side, is that, like many others, I didn't predict President Trump's election. And most importantly, even then I didn't predict the disregard for law that has been a hallmark of the administration. And I believe we're seeing an interesting change. Rather than what we had before, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the civilians had to control the military, today we have the military trying in a more subtle way to exert some restraint on civilians with respect to the disregard of law. Talk about this now when I talk about the cliffs on the backside of the summit. Here, I must say, I was shocked when John Bolton wrote his essay in the Wall Street Journal saying that there is a legal case for what he called a preemptive war against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, in that there were very few people who came out against that, saying, no, the legal case is really weak. Because what Bolton was doing, as he did in 2002, was trying to conflate preemption with preventive war. He was not talking about a launch if an attack is imminent and considered unavoidable, which I think is legal. He was talking about a war started because we don't like somebody getting weapons that could threaten us. And President Trump's threats to the North Koreans, again, told or spoke of a disregard for law. The NPR, by the way, I think gets this right when they say that if Kim Jong-un ever uses nuclear weapons, it will be the end of his regime. That's a good deterrent threat. To say, if you keep threatening us, we have no choice but to totally destroy you, is an argument for preventive war. The UN Charter has a name for that. It's called aggression. And it has been surprising to me how easily many of us in all parts of the profession have started to use preemption in place for preventive war. And I urge all of us not to do that. It has also been concerning to me, as anyone who studies, say, Saddam's decision-making and see the obsequiousness by which the initial decisions were made, as people told Saddam how great he was, it gave a chill to watch the first cabinet meeting of the Trump administration, where virtually everyone, not everyone, there were some exceptions, very important exceptions, but it was like a competition to see who could praise the president rather than a serious meeting to discuss important questions. We have a real danger when a politician surrounds himself with yes men who tell him what they think he wants to hear. It's such a grave crisis that the Senate has held hearings to say, should we change the command and control system, as you all know? And some of those concerns were, I think, somewhat alleviated, at least in the public view, when General Kaler, in the testimony to the Senate, and then General Hyten, in a public speech, both said that they would never follow an illegal order. And I think that's right. I know both of them moderately well, and I think they are saying what they truly believe. But I think that is somewhat misleading, because what both of the gentlemen are talking about, both of the current and former STRATCOM commanders are talking about, are the laws of armed conflict of use in bello, that is, the laws when you are engaged in combat. And they are telling us, which is, I believe is true, that all plans are vetted by the JAG Corps. The JAG Corps, if you include that nationwide, the Pentagon, the Defense Department is the world's largest law firm. And those plans are all vetted and are deemed legal. What both generals are not talking about is the decision to go to war. Is the decision to go to war legal? And I believe that they are trained to say, that's your choice. That's the civilian's job. And that's what we want in normal civil-military relations. That is the civilian's job. But what do you do if you're concerned that the civilians are making a really bad choice and possibly an illegal choice? That's new grounds that we haven't been in before, with one possible exception. And that was in 1974, when at the end of the Nixon administration, then Secretary James Schlesinger told the Joint Chiefs that if there is a order to use military force coming from the president, I want you to contact me before you do that. That was an extra constitutional order from the Secretary of Defense, but it was wise. I think we're in that situation all the time. And that the military has to be thinking about our decisions, not just about how to fight, but whether to go to war legal. And that's why I agree with Dick Betts and Matt Waxman in their piece in Foreign Affairs recently, saying that the Secretary of Defense and the Attorney General should be in the chain of command, determine whether the orders are authentic and whether they are legal for any first use of nuclear weapons. And the last cliff on the backside of the summit I'll mention very briefly is the risk of accidents. And here I'm less concerned about the United States than I am about the DPRK. We're all familiar with the Hawaii incident, when a false warning that a DPRK missile was coming at Hawaii, people locally panicked, but the command system did not, for three reasons. One, we have lots of redundant sensors that said, no, there's no attack coming, don't get ready for a war. Two, the people in charge immediately said, oh, there's a problem, and they reported up. They were willing to admit mistakes, as you would hope would have here. And lastly, we didn't really think that Kim Jong-un was about to launch an attack against Hawaii. So we assumed that it's likely to be an accident rather than likely to be real. Consider for one moment what would happen if a similar incident occurred today in North Korea. First off, they have a far less redundant warning system. Second, would their officers be brave enough to say, oh, we've just really screwed up, knowing what the consequences are in their system for screwing up? And C, they do think that we might attack them. Why? Because we keep telling them we might attack them. And so even if we do have an agreement that calms the crisis and has some kind of trade-off of things on our side for their side, I think we're going to have nuclear weapons there for quite a long time, and the risk of accidents will remain, and the risk that an accident could trigger something more serious will depend in part on whether we calm down the rhetoric of going to war if they don't follow our behavior. Then lastly, let me say a few comments on the NPT, because here, as Susan knows well, I've held the belief for a long time that Article 6 of the NPT should not be interpreted as just a pledge by the nuclear weapon states to work in good faith towards the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons, but states quite directly that all state members to the treaty must work. And there's no agreement about what exactly the non-state members should do, but I've argued that one thing that could be considered part of their responsibility is to sign the additional protocol to make it safer to have reductions and to have mutual constraint on systems, because you'll have more faith in the nuclear inspection system. I am concerned here that the nuclear ban treaty may well have two negative effects. One is that the trading off of things from the nuclear states to the non-nuclear states. Look, if you sign the additional protocol, then we'll reduce forces, and the kinds of bargaining processes that take place in NPT review conferences in the period between them may have less pressure, because the nuclear states are alienated from the non-nuclear states, and the non-nuclear states are even more alienated from the nuclear states, and that the non-nuclear states are taking pressure off themselves for an additional protocol, as noticed by the ban treaty not requiring states to sign the additional protocol. If you're a non-nuclear weapon state, sign the ban treaty. Even if it comes into force, you don't have to sign the additional protocol. And that's deeply unfortunate. So I'm, like all of you, very much looking forward to the summit next week, but I think there are some cliffs that will exist for quite a long period of time afterwards, even in the best case scenario, and in the worst case scenario, they're going to be really dangerous. And I, like many of you, are looking forward to the next NPT review conference in hopes that there can be some bargain reached by which states don't have a complete break of the system. But even there, I'm afraid my pessimistic streak is coming out. So let me turn this over to Susan to start the commentary.
Okay. I have to pull myself out of my depression. Are you going to stay sitting? Yeah. I'm going to stay seated. I got to get over the gloom now, but thanks, Scott. That's a tough act to follow. I really want to thank Mike Crapon for putting on this event, and just truth in advertising. I'm a Sagan pessimist. I'm an NPT realist, and I'm a cautious optimist. And I have my copy of the book as well, and I do recommend it. It's a great book. Now, I spent my career in public service, as some of you know, working to reduce the number and prevent the further spread of nuclear weapons in the world. And preventing further horizontal proliferation was always the policy of every administration I worked for. I never saw any evidence that Dr. Walsh's more is better theory was influencing U.S. non-proliferation policy. So it's an interesting theory, but that certainly was not what we were pursuing in the government. U.S. non-proliferation policy was consistent, it was bipartisan, and it derived from the view that the more countries with nuclear weapons and the more nuclear weapons in the world, the greater the risk of their use by design, miscalculation, or accident, and that is certainly Scott's view. Limiting the possession of nuclear weapons to the P5 and ensuring U.S. nuclear superiority figured into it as well, I'm quite sure, and I think that's a view that you may have. We can get nostalgic thinking about the simplicity of the bipolar world of the past, as dangerous as it was, when we contemplate the complicated international scene today. But given that complicated scene, I'd find it really difficult to try to justify or rationalize either further weapons proliferation or the continued possession of thousands of weapons by a few states as the path to greater security and stability. Further nuclear weapons proliferation complicates both U.S. security calculations and U.S. nonproliferation policy. And as a result, the U.S. has traditionally been a leader in promoting universal adherence to and compliance with the NPT. And I would also say they also had been aggressively promoting adherence to the additional protocol. The U.S. was traditionally the leader in the diplomatic pursuit of new NPT parties as well. I remember in the early days when I was working on the NPT, there was a tremendous diplomatic effort to encourage states to join the NPT, and universal adherence to the treaty was seen as the best way to fulfill the NPT's nonproliferation goal, the nonproliferation pillar. In 1980, there were 112 parties. By the time 1995, when the treaty was extended indefinitely, 178 parties. Today, the NPT has 190 parties, 185 of which are countries legally obligated not to acquire nuclear weapons. So there are 4 countries outside the treaty. We know them well, and they're complicated. But the treaty is not technically universal, but it's pretty darn close in my book. It's good enough for government work. And the NPT non-nuclear weapon states are, for all practical purposes, in compliance with their treaty obligations. And I'll mention Iran. We can talk about that. The NPT also, as you know, has become the vehicle for holding the P5 in particular, although in more recent years they've begun to pay at least lip service to the countries outside of the treaty, India, Pakistan, Israel, of course, perennial, and North Korea. But this has been a way to hold the P5 accountable for their actions to implement Article 6, and having achieved nearly universal adherence, and so I think in the views of many, having gotten very close to that goal, the heat's been turned up on the 5. They have been pressed, and they have committed in NPT review conferences to reduce and irreversibly eliminate their stockpiles transparently, verifiably, and irreversibly. And more recently, non-nuclear weapon states have encouraged the nuclear weapon states to take measures to reduce the risk of use, such as de-alerting. These are measures that the P5 have not been willing to accept. So whether or not you believe that the NPT's Article 6 was part of a bargain, and some argue that there was no bargain, I think there was. That was then, this is now. There is certainly a widely held understanding today that this is part of the bargain. And I think this was the case even before President Obama said it so explicitly at his Prague speech. Now, at the same time the P5 are being pressed, you have to give credit to at least 4 of the nuclear weapon states for having made substantial, tangible progress reducing their existing arsenals. And U.S. stockpiles, as U.S. officials will say repeatedly, are at their lowest level since the 1950s. That there are still thousands of weapons, however, leads to criticism that progress to fulfill the NPT's non-proliferation goal has not been matched by the same progress towards a disarmament goal. And so that's where we get into this. We've done our part, you haven't done your part. And the Nuclear Ban Treaty has emerged as what I would call the concrete reflection and demonstration of international frustration over the pace of nuclear disarmament, or the progress that's been made to the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, love it or hate it, the Ban Treaty reflects the concerns of a large number of countries, including NPT parties, about the catastrophic consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. No low-yield warheads or escalate to de-escalate strategies are going to assuage the concerns that produce this agreement. Rather, I believe that these proposals and concepts that were reflected in the latest Nuclear Posture Review and in other statements exacerbate concerns about nuclear weapons use because they appear to lower the threshold for such use. So I think it's exactly the opposite effect. At its heart, the Ban Treaty is a rejection of nuclear weapons and of nuclear deterrence as a security strategy. Now, I'll let others debate the enduring merits of deterrence theory, and I know my history a bit. I know who burned down the White House in 1812, but I know that nuclear weapons have not been used in anger or by miscalculation or accident in more than 70 years, and that's a really good thing. But I also believe that luck had no small part to play in this, and I think Scott mentioned the accidents. Most recently, we've seen reports of missileers using LSD while they're in missile silos. we've been darn lucky, I think. And we have the tightest security and the highest operational levels, and we still have been saved by dumb luck. When the stakes are as high as they are if deterrence fails, I think not everyone's satisfied with the proposition that some argue that because nuclear deterrence has worked in the past and it's followed, then we can be confident it's going to work. We can assume it will work in the future. And I had a line here, we know what they say about assume, but the Bands Treaty's impact on the NPT regime is still to be determined. I think Scott's put his finger on a really important point, which is the verification provisions, which are far below what anyone would want. But the Ban Treaty, again, love it or hate it, it's helping to change the conversation about nuclear weapons, and I'll come back to this in my cautiously optimistic conclusion. Now, I looked most recently at what the U.S., I am not a consultant for the U.S., that was on some of the websites. I have no association with the U.S. government, I'm a retiree. But I looked at what the U.S. delegation was saying at the PrepCom in May, and in their opening statement, they laid out a strong and long defense of the non-proliferation pillar of the treaty and how the success of the treaty has benefited all countries. And it's a very interesting and well-argued point. But they go on to argue that the conditions for nuclear disarmament don't exist now. I agree. And creating those conditions is the responsibility of all parties to the NPT. I agree with that as well. But I'm not sure what we're asking other parties to do in connection with the U.S.-Russian standoff, and that seems to be the principal obstacle right now in terms of forward movement on arms control. And then I read the U.S. working paper submitted for the second PrepCom on creating the conditions for nuclear disarmament, which is an interesting one. And I looked again at this paper last night to make sure I wasn't taking it out of context, and I'm sure some will argue that I did, but the sentence that caught my eye was, if we wish possessor states to conclude that they will remain secure without nuclear weapons and that disarmament is therefore possible, they must have confidence in the near universal adherence by other states to the treaty and in their continued compliance with their non-proliferation obligations. So I'm assuming that by possessor states, they mean us. All I could think was, well, the NPT enjoys near universal adherence, in quotes, that's what they said. And it's near full compliance. I don't think any of the non-nuclear weapon states right now are technically in non-compliance, although maybe, I mean, I've been out of the government for a while, maybe they are. So if the NPT community is a bit confused by all of this, I think they can be forgiven. Now, there are many steps to take on the road to eliminating all nuclear weapons, and we need to figure out which ones can be taken now, and what are the things that need help from outside, and what are the things that we need, I think the US and others need to do on their own. And while further dramatic progress on disarmament seems very unlikely in the near term, extension of the New START agreement is in both countries' interest. It should be low-hanging fruit. I understand why it's hung up, but it would be a very welcome step. It would break the ice, and hopefully both sides will conclude, particularly the United States, that it's doable on its merits and that it would be better to extend the treaty than not to extend the treaty. I think this is the easiest one and hope it doesn't get hung up on other issues and just is able to move ahead. I want to mention briefly U.S. leadership because I think this is really critical, and this goes to some of the comments you say, which I'm not going to be quite as tough because it'll get me all upset. But I think U.S. leadership has been critical to successes in the non-proliferation and disarmament realm in the past. And I think if you look back, the negotiation of the NPT, other things, the U.S. was always in a lead role. During the 2010 NPT review conference, a senior non-aligned ambassador who I'd known for a long, long time told me, U.S. leadership is essential but not sufficient. And I thought, that's really true. In the old days, it might have been sufficient, U.S. and Soviet leadership, but right now it's essential but not sufficient. And that's the reality we're facing in today's world. We have to work in partnership with like-minded states who don't always have to be our traditional allies. And that is often the best and sometimes the only way to produce the result that we're all seeking. Now, I want to come to Iran, which I tread very delicately because I'm not an expert. But I do know that it wasn't perfect, but it was a significant multilateral non-proliferation achievement that addressed a festering problem, a long festering problem, and it bought time, which is basically the role of diplomacy, is to buy time so you can work other issues here. And it's been successful in that regard. Now, as far as I know, Iran was in compliance with the JCPOA. The State Department compliance report said they were, and that's a tough group of people. So if they said they were, they were. Secretary of State and Defense said they were in compliance. And yet the president decided to abandon the agreement that had halted nuclear activities of concern in Iran and imposed strict and intrusive safeguards to verify the agreement's provisions. Now, the JCPOA capped a long and difficult NPT chapter, and it was widely seen as positive, and it was seen as a way to deal with these problems. Not ideally, but in the end, it was a way to deal with it. And while it was argued that it wasn't a precedent, it demonstrated the possibilities when states get together and work together and try to, deal with tough problems. With the U.S. unilateral decision to walk away from the agreement, both U.S. leadership and its assertions about the importance of compliance, I believe, are in question. It's too soon to tell how this will play out and impact future discussions, but I don't say that lightly. The U.S. said it would be reaching out to allies to consider next steps. Hopefully they have a plan B that does not involve giving Iran a pretext to leave the NPT, and I worry about that. That would do irreparable harm to the regime. It would undermine the IEA. It could reduce incentives for other states to agree to halt activities of concern. And in the worst case scenario, but not impossible, it could lead to other defections from the NPT, especially in the Middle East. And that's the last thing in the world we need. Now, all eyes are on the Singapore summit. I have to say, will Dennis Rodman have a speaking role? I don't know. Will he be wearing a dress? We know very little about the preparations or the objectives for the summit, frankly. I think we see different kinds of things. It kind of depends on who's going to be in the room. And we see the evidence that there's a tussle over who's going to be in the room. It's a moving target. And so the summit offers a chance to begin a process to address the DPRK's nuclear weapons program and begin to bring it back into the non-proliferation mainstream. And there's some very good people, career professionals and experts who have been drugged back into it. That's a good thing, but we'll have to see what happens. So there are possibilities here, but I'm not real optimistic. We'll know more. So to conclude why I'm cautiously optimistic, I said at the beginning that I am cautiously optimistic, and it's been a survival technique for me, and I think it is for those of us who work in this field. If you're not generally or cautiously optimistic, why get up in the morning and go to work? Or why read your newspaper? So you have to kind of just do that. But I am optimistic for a couple of reasons. First, as I read statements by other states and papers that are being done, and the work that's being done by NGOs, support for the NPT and the international nuclear non-proliferation regime in all its aspects remains very strong generally. And I'm confident that new states will step up to leadership roles if traditional states do not. And in a piece that Michael Crapon did, which I read to prepare for this, Proliferation, Optimism versus Pessimism, he has a quote in here from Richard Haas, somebody that I knew in the Pentagon when we were both teenagers. But he has a quote here: "The cold truth is that the alternative to a US-led international order is less international order." That may be true, but I do believe that if the US is not up to the task right now, I think others will step up. I think we have some strong allies and we have others, and I think support for the regime is going to lead people to maybe step out a little bit more while they wait for the US to get its act together and come back. I think this is important because a strong non-proliferation regime that prizes and enforces compliance and tangible progress to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons requires the support of the entire international community. So we have to pull together, and I think there's reason to believe that countries will not let this all fall apart. The second reason I'm cautiously optimistic is that domestic and international developments have stimulated a level of constructive and urgent conversations among states and civil society about these issues. Sylvia Mishra, who is a friend and a colleague, and I were talking about this before. There's a level of activism in this country, of civic activism, that I've never seen before, and I think we're seeing a level of activism on these issues of nuclear proliferation, and hopefully this will continue. And this will help to generate, information and education and lead to greater activism in support of non-proliferation disarmament goals. And in that regard, one of the newer Track 2 groups that's been organized in Japan is the group of eminent persons for substantive advancement of nuclear disarmament. I first heard about this group when I was out at Monterey at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies last fall. But it's a really good group of serious people. Our own Ambassador Linton Brooks, who many of you know, and George Perkovich from Carnegie are members of this group. And they just produced a paper recently called Building Bridges to Effective Nuclear Disarmament, and I would commend it to your attention if you haven't read it. It's a very serious discussion of ways to build bridges among a group of experts who are not, I would say, not a bunch of doves. I mean, these are serious people with great expertise. So these are the kinds of things that I see emerging that are positive. And all of this helps, I think, contribute to creative thinking, deeper thinking, and problem solving. And the third, and it's related to the second point, but I want to make this, I made this point before I saw a number of people in the audience I know. The other thing that really keeps me from throwing myself off my roof is that interest in this field is very high among the next generation, both here in this country and internationally. And many of us have had the opportunity to work with and mentor these next generation experts and policymakers. It's such a blessing. It's their brilliance and enthusiasm and their passion that I think about when I'm feeling discouraged about the news. And when Scott says that the younger people are less likely to use nuclear weapons than the older people, I said, yes, that's great. So I think that they're
old too someday, though.
well, I know, but hopefully they'll bring these views. So I think there's reason to be optimistic in the future because there is this new wave of people coming in, I think, right thinking with, I got to cut it off. Anyway, that's why I'm optimistic. Thanks.
Well, I think I'm up next. I'd also like to begin by thanking Michael Craycon and the Stimson Center for hosting this important event. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to get together and consider Scott Sagan and Kenneth Walsh's important book, The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, an Enduring Debate. And in fact, I was a PhD student at the University of California, Berkeley in the early 2000s, and Berkeley didn't have a great nuclear security studies program at the time, something I didn't find out until I arrived, and should have done more research. And so I drove down south a little bit to Stanford, and Scott Sagan was gracious enough to allow me to attend some of the workshops at CSAP at Stanford, and then a few years later had me on as a pre-doctoral fellow. So I really owe Professor Sagan a debt of gratitude for his help in development of my career. So in my 10 minutes, I wanted to do four things. First, I also wanted to talk about what I think Sagan gets right, what he gets wrong. Third, I want to talk a little bit about
and result in nuclear use. So essentially, engaging in a kind of rational process, trying to use nuclear threats to achieve your goals, there's a risk of nuclear use. So that would be my critique, that he doesn't go far enough, that he should take the optimist on in the central logic of rational deterrence theory. A third point, Trump's nuclear policy. So there's been some criticism of Trump's nuclear policy. I would just say I think the greatest threats the United States and our allies face in the nuclear realm is not Donald Trump, but Russia, North Korea, Iran, China. So Russia has moved nuclear weapons more to the center of its military strategy. I think the risk of nuclear war with Russia is probably higher today than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Not that it's high, but it's relatively higher than it has been, in part because of Russia's ideas of de-escalatory nuclear strikes, using nuclear weapons early in a conflict with NATO. North Korea expanding and modernizing its nuclear capabilities, may become only the third country after Russia and China to have the ability to hold the U.S. homeland at risk with threats of nuclear war. China has a more relaxed nuclear doctrine, and that's a good thing, but they too are expanding and modernizing their nuclear capabilities. And Iran, of course, has a latent nuclear capability. So there are serious nuclear threats out there. I think the nuclear threat environment has changed quite a bit since Obama wrote his nuclear posture review in 2010. And so I think on balance, the Trump nuclear policy has been pretty good, actually. Not perfect, but pretty good. The nuclear posture review, I thought, was a reasonable document that understood the nuclear threat environment and talked about how the United States needs to have a serious deterrence strategy and capabilities to deal with these threats. North Korea, the purpose of the Trump administration's policy on North Korea from the very beginning was maximum pressure and engagement, trying to increase the economic military pressure on North Korea to force them to the table to discuss denuclearization. So far, so good. We've got an upcoming summit where Kim Jong-un says he's willing to talk about denuclearization. I think there are many reasons to believe that this won't work out, but I think it's worth a shot, and this was the strategy all along. So I think some credit is due there. And then finally on Iran, Iran is a difficult situation. The deal achieved some things, but there was a big problem in the sunset clauses, that all these limits expired over time, and once they expired, they would have allowed Iran to ramp up the program. And so even supporters of the deal, former Obama administration officials, European diplomats, in the past year or so have gone from supporting the deal to saying, well, we need to fix the deal. We need to try to renegotiate it, to try to get these sunsets kicked further into the future. There were negotiations underway on this point for the past year or so. But the Europeans were willing to make some statements on changing parts of the deal, but not all of it. And we really had no leverage to renegotiate. It was going to be very difficult to go back to Iran and say, make these limits permanent. So I think I would have handled it somewhat different than the Trump administration did, but by pulling out of the deal, you do create the opportunity that we can bring real pressure back to bear on Iran that could force a better deal. Again, bad situation with no good options, but I think there is a logic to pulling out and trying to reinstate pressure. Final point, U.S. nuclear strategy. Susan Burk talked about why the United States continues to possess thousands of nuclear weapons, and this is a question that's commonly asked. And in fact, academic nuclear deterrence theory says that essentially once you have a second strike capability, a few dozen or a few hundred nuclear weapons on submarines, that's enough to absorb an enemy nuclear attack, retaliate with a devastating second strike. That should be enough for deterrence. So why does the United States possess thousands of nuclear weapons, counter-force targeting, missile defenses? And in fact, I think this may be one of the biggest puzzles in all of international security studies. We have these theories that say a second strike capability is enough, but the United States has always had this large, more robust posture. So why is that the case? Well, academics who have looked at this before have said, well, the answer is easy. Our theories are right. The real world is wrong. The United States doesn't understand. And in fact, Robert Jervis, an eminent political scientist, wrote a great book several decades ago called The Illogic of American Nuclear Strategy, making this point. So what I try to do in my new book, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy, is explain why the United States possesses this large arsenal. And I think there is a logic to it. It's not that U.S. leaders are crazy. And I think there are two things that are distinctive about U.S. nuclear policy. So first, as Professor Sagan mentioned, is counter-force targeting. Some people think of nuclear deterrence as we threaten to slaughter innocent civilians in cities. They threaten to slaughter our innocent civilians, and we're deterred. But the United States doesn't do that. The United States plans to target enemy nuclear, military and nuclear-related sites. And so if you're going to do that, then your number of nuclear weapons depends on the number of enemy nuclear and military sites. If they have a large number, you also need a large number to target them. And the United States does that in part for legal and moral reasons, and President Obama was very clear about that. We don't intentionally slaughter innocent civilians. We only go after legitimate military targets. Second thing that's distinctive about the United States is we're not just trying to deter attacks on ourselves. We're trying to deter attacks against the entire free world. 30 formal treaty allies in Europe and Asia depend on U.S. nuclear umbrella for their security. And so if you're trying to deter attacks on the entire free world, that requires a more robust posture than just deterring attacks on yourself. So I think if the United States wanted to throw the laws of war out the window and just threaten to slaughter people in Moscow and Beijing, if we wanted to withdraw from the world and not provide security in Asia and Europe, then we could afford to greatly reduce our arsenal. But as long as we want to comply with the law of armed conflict, as long as we want to continue to provide geopolitical stability in Europe and Asia, then I think the United States will continue to require a robust nuclear force. And I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.
I'm actually going to, can you all hear me? Take the opportunity to stand, and I'm going to give you all the opportunity to do that too. Let's consider this a seventh inning stretch. We've been going for a long time. If you all want to stand up for just a minute, stretch your legs. Yeah, exactly. You all have been very patient and sitting a long time, so thank you. And I promise I will, in fact, I'm going to use my nifty timer here.
Oh, thanks. Yours too.
And it's frozen, so I won't use my nifty timer here. So there's a lot of really interesting commentary that my colleagues have already provided, and I could literally spend the remainder of the afternoon just commenting on the comments, but I don't have the liberty of the time to do that, and you all wouldn't want to stay here that long anyway. So let me just, a few highlights. First, just to share my perspective, I am an optimist by nature. And so even though I think we're in an incredibly dangerous period, and there are many, many reasons for pessimism, and we've heard many of them already, I am not someone who wants to give up. And so I want to focus in this last segment on some suggested solutions, recommendations, given that we're in this very difficult place. Where do we go from here? I think one of the most important things we need to do to save the NPT, to make sure that it can endure for another 50 years, is find a way to reestablish some common ground among the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. And we need to not only recommit to finding that common ground, but to finding some joint actions that we can take together. Where would I start? First, and I think this is really fundamental, this is the most important thing, and if we can't get it right, I think it's going to be hard to ever really secure the NPT. And that is, we need together to develop a new, modern understanding of the risks. We have this quaint, nostalgic, and frankly ossified way of thinking about nuclear risks. We've just been talking about deterrence theory. And we've been taught in the academic community and through our military to think about the risk of nuclear use as tied to how well we are doing at deterring each other. And as long as we have survivable forces postured in a way that sustains strategic stability and have rational leaders that understand there would be no advantage in using nuclear weapons, that nuclear risk is manageable and nuclear use is unlikely to happen. But I mean, you know, in fact, Matt, thank you for talking about and reinforcing the ways in which deterrence theory can go wrong. But I would argue in today's world, it is necessary but not sufficient, and frankly may be irrelevant to the mounting risks that we face with nuclear weapons. So what do I mean, and why is that true? Let me talk about some of the threats that were not really contemplated at all when nuclear deterrence theory was developed. Cyber vulnerabilities. We can't assume that systems with digital components, and that includes our nuclear systems, are not already or will not be compromised. We cannot assume that they will perform as designed when called upon. This is not just me speculating. The Defense Science Board in 2013 came to that conclusion. There are many ways in which our weapons, not just our nuclear weapons, but the whole system that wraps around them could be contemplated. So think about that for just a moment. How does deterrence work if you don't know whether your systems are going to work, whether your command and control is working, whether it's being spoofed, whether what looks like an incoming attack is really an incoming attack? How does deterrence work? So that's, you know, one current vulnerability that deterrence doesn't help us with. Second, non-state actors acquiring and detonating a nuclear device. Non-state actors are not worried about being deterred, right? So deterrence is irrelevant to that threat. Third thing, misinformation, miscalculation. We all know about technical failures in parts of our system. That's well documented. It's happened. We've had many near misses. Another challenge, accidents. And Scott, thank you. Scott literally has written the book on accidents and chronicled the many ways in which we've been lucky so far. Minot Barksdale being not an accident exactly, but an incident, and an important one that could have ended very badly. Again, deterrence irrelevant to that threat. What about irrational leaders? Right? We've just talked about that. That's a significant challenge. Do we have a functioning government? Is the decisional process that we've wrapped around nuclear weapons in place? So I've used up most of my time talking about this, but I think this is really important. We need to come together as a community, nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, and really reassess the risks and come up with a new set of actions to address these risks. And I think it really needs to start with a shift in our attitudes about nuclear weapons. We have got to get away from thinking that deterrence is going to save us. It's not that simple. Deterrence, again, necessary but not sufficient. In fact, woefully insufficient in today's world. Joint action. So I'll just quickly run a list and then I'll stop. First and foremost, we have got to reestablish bilateral discussions with Russia. If the US can't show leadership and together with Russia demonstrate progress, we are not going to make progress with the rest of the world. We are not going to be able to ask non-nuclear weapon states to continue to forbear and take on obligations indefinitely. We've run the string on that. Next, there's a whole slate of things we can do to reduce the risk of use. I'll just spit out a few ideas. You know, we need to seriously focus on minimizing risk of accidents. We need to find ways to increase decision time. It's insane that our leaders have. We'd be lucky if they have 15 minutes to make a decision that could be life-altering, right? Have existential consequences. We need to work hard on the cyber vulnerabilities, but we are never, and this was another, I think, stunning conclusion of the Defense Science Board's report, there is no technical solution to cyber vulnerabilities. So again, think about that for a minute. If there's no technical solution, we can never have confidence, complete confidence in our forces, then we need to think seriously about the consequences of what happens when the system fails and work to mitigate the worst case consequences. We need to lower the temperature. Whole series of things to lower the temperature, reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our security policy, seek a universal no first use policy. This goes together with the attitudes, shifting our attitudes. And we need to get serious about building the international architecture we need to regulate dangerous dual-use technologies while protecting all states' right to peaceful applications. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done on the fuel cycle. Safeguards, additional protocol, really important, but they don't go far enough. We're never going to get to the vision of a world without nuclear weapons if we can't find a way to close these kind of gaping, I like to call it a loophole in the existing architecture. And the last thing, we need to renew the global public's understanding of the risks of nuclear use and the consequences. We've forgot a lot about what we knew. I mean, there's a whole generation of folks who don't appreciate how destructive nuclear weapons can be. And I think we're at a point in time, world events give us an opportunity to help do some of that education with the summit coming up in North Korea, just rising nuclear dangers generally. As unfortunate as the Hawaii false warning was, I think that was important for beginning to give people a visceral sense of the danger and to begin to think anew about these threats and hopefully to hold their political leaders accountable for more leadership, more action, more vision. That's where it's got to start, and I will end with that thought. So thank you very much. And Michael, thank you.
I've been pretty relaxed with the timer because when you have people this accomplished with this much to say, you don't ring a bell. But it does mean we don't have much time. So I am going to take 5 questions from the floor, preferably not comments. If they're long comments, I am going to ring the bell. 5 questions all at once, and we will then ask the panel to react. Please. Hold on. There you go.
My name is Cláudia Trevisan from the Brazilian newspaper O Estado de São Paulo. Could you, each of you, give a brief evaluation of what do you expect from the summit in Singapore? What is the realistic expectation, and what would be a completely fail of the
Great
summit?
question. Who's second? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Valeria Lozova, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace intern. So Russian Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov commented saying that Russia will try to shift to conventional deterrence with high-precision weapons, boost-glide weapons and stuff. What is your opinions? What are your opinions on this topic? Will it somehow lower the temperatures within deterrence sphere or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. And then this gentleman over here.
Hello. Alicia Dressman, Nuclear Policy Specialist. My question pertains to this broader idea within the NPT of developing a common definition within the P5 of what constitutes stockpile modernization. I know we had the P5 glossary that came out in 2015 NPT RevCon. I didn't really see anything coming out of that glossary of the conference that gave us a real concrete idea of how the NWS defines stockpile modernization.
Thank you. Just hand it over there.
Terry Taylor from International Council for the Life Sciences. Thank you so much for the excellent insights. My question is about risk. And most of the debate or discussion has been about nuclear on nuclear, although that's not excluding other events. Isn't the risk greater, perhaps because of security issues in the non-nuclear area? India, Pakistan is a classic example. It's the threat of conventional invasion, one could argue. And also, Joan Rohlfing mentioned nuclear terrorists. Is there a danger of being a prisoner of the past if we focus so much on the nuclear deterrence that we'll miss the other risks? Thank you very much.
Sure. One last, real quick.
Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. In addition to the measures to reduce the threat of non-deterrence, what about dealing with addressing the underlying conflicts, doing conflict analysis? What do the parties want? Reducing tension in that way, which is also in the UN Charter that isn't generally addressed.
Thanks. All right, number 6. And that's it.
Thank you. My name is Christina Pendergast. I am with the Osgood Institute, and I am wondering as to regarding Iran. Some have commented in support of leaving the deal. Some have commented that it was better to have tried to work it out. What do you believe would have been required to keep us in the deal in the first place? And having left it, what would be required to not only reinitiate, but reinitiate in a way that would promote peace, not only in the region for now, but in the region for the coming decades? Thank you.
Great question. So, panel, you don't have to answer every single question. I would prefer if you picked and choose. So, Scott, why don't you go first?
I'll make 2 comments then. One, to link up the first and the last questions about the summit in Iran. I think that there will be a positive agreement, but very, very limited at the summit, ending the war. There won't be a peace treaty. That needs the ROK and others to be involved. It will take a long time. But a simple signature, as long as you could then fax in the Chinese signature, that says this officially is the end of the war, could turn an armistice into a termination of the war. I think that the North Koreans are going to make pledges about working towards disarmament, and the U.S. will make pledges about gradually reducing sanctions, but they're going to continue jockeying. And a good reason why the North Koreans are distrustful, about what will happen next is that they have to be concerned that we walked out of the last agreement that we made, and as hard as it is to have a credible threat, it's very difficult to have a credible promise that we will continue to follow these. And the rhetoric of the administration turning back and forth, well, this latest turn towards an agreement, and a summit is a good one, the return of fire and fury rhetoric and preventive war rhetoric is just as easily to come back if there's any fallback. And one last comment. The second one is that I did want to disagree with Matt Kroenig's comments that following the laws of armed conflict mean that you have to have thousands of nuclear weapons because of counterforce targeting. Well, I think, frankly, there are relatively few targets the United States needs nuclear weapons to destroy in the modern world. Jeffrey Lewis and I wrote an article called The Nuclear Necessity Principle, in which we said that we should have a policy statement that we will not target any target with a nuclear weapon that we have a reasonable chance of destroying with a conventional weapon. Many people agreed with that article, but one former military officer said, you can't do that because that will reduce collateral damage. I said, yeah, that's the point. That's why we want to do it. He said, well, if you reduce collateral damage, you'll weaken deterrence. And I argued that if you're using collateral damage for strategic purposes, it's not collateral anymore. But I think we need to really rethink counterforce doctrine in that kind of conventional policy.
Thanks, Scott. Joan, why don't you go second?
Actually, that was meant to be a two-finger intervention, but I'm happy to go
Go ahead.
second. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Just on the counterforce point, because I also wanted an opportunity to pick up on Matt's comment. The idea that we would be able to use a massive strike against military targets anywhere near a city and not have massive collateral damage is I think, pretty crazy. And so I also have issues with the idea that
While you're there,
Yeah.
do you want to respond
I
to
do. Yes, I
Please.
do. Let me take the first one, too, what to expect from the summit. I have pretty low expectations, and I think we should all have pretty low expectations. And I think low expectations is important because, and I worry mostly about, frankly, the president's expectations, that he has very high and unachievable expectations that will not be met and that will end in, from my perspective, a failure of this will be if they agree, well, if they decide they won't go forward, that they're just going to quit talking. Success, in my book, is a summit where they both agree to keep talking. That would be successful. Wild success would be if they agree to some basic principles, which can then be turned into a framework and negotiated over a multi-month, maybe even a multi-year period of time. This is extremely complex, what they're attempting to do. It's going to take time. People need to be patient. I hope they keep talking. Failure would be if they just give up and walk away. I'll stop it there.
Matt, go ahead.
Colleagues
great.
a chance to-
Well, first, since my arguments were invoked, I'll respond briefly to those. So I completely agree that there'd be collateral damage to any nuclear war, but there's a difference between purposely trying to slaughter civilians and trying to target military targets with collateral damage. And on Scott's point, I think it would be wonderful if we had the capability to hold at risk enemy strategic targets with only conventional weapons, but I don't think we're there yet, and that might be a longer conversation. And that would be my response to the question about Russia as well. I think they would like to substitute some of these strategic conventional forces for nuclear. I think the escalate to de-escalate in a way is a sign of weakness, they see that as their best option. So I think they'd like to get away from that. But I don't think they're there yet. So I think the escalate to de-escalate risk remains. I'll just do one more on the Iran deal. If we could have gotten Iran to agree to make the limits on its nuclear program permanent, I think that would have been satisfactory. Others would have said that's not enough, we need zero enrichment, but I think allowing enrichment with permanent limits, I think would have been enough to satisfy the Trump administration. What would be good enough going forward? Pompeo gave a speech on Trump's Plan B. He had 12 conditions the Trump administration was looking for in future negotiations with Iran. And there, one of them was zero enrichment. So I don't know if it's a change or if it's starting with the maximalist demand and then a willingness to negotiate down from that.
Susan.
Let me take one that wasn't picked. This is on the glossary and talking about stockpile modernization. I have no idea. I don't think they did address that issue. But that might be an interesting issue if the P5 were still meeting. I don't know whether they're still meeting in that format. And it could be an interesting discussion because each of the sides is accusing the others of doing this, and they're all doing it to some extent. So maybe there would be some value into discussing that. I think the P5 process inherently was quite valuable to at least have a conversation going. I'm not sure that it's continuing right now, but hopefully it will.
I'm going to close with a couple of messages. First, thank you, audience, for coming. Thank you, streamers out there. We appreciate your tuning in. And this conversation will be available for access at any time in the future, because it'll be on the Stimson Center's website, www.stimson.org. 2, the next in our series of contemplating nuclear danger and the nuclear future. Please mark on your calendars July 30th. Heather Williams will be crossing the Atlantic to join us, and we have a great panel also for her presentation. Next to last, Joan mentioned the false alarm in Hawaii. To me, that was such a teachable moment, because I started to think, okay, if I had 15 minutes, I've got kids on the East Coast, the West Coast, grandkids, loved ones, family. What would I do in that 15 minutes? I think if we asked ourselves, what would I do in that 15 minutes? if the threat were real. That concentrates the mind. And I utterly agree with you, Joan, that through creative methods and new energy, it's crucial for us to re-engage with this issue. And I too think this is happening. And both our NGOs are part of it. I'm proud of that. I think NTI's programming is just outstanding. Lastly, please join with me to thank our speaker and our commentators for their commitment to the field, for giving us a lot to think about and to read. So, all the best to you. Thank you.